Well, here we are once again. We're going to continue on with the axial skeleton. This time we're going to rotate around to the posterior side and take a look at the vertebral column, or your spinal column, and the bones that help protect your spinal cord from damage. Kind of important, as you guys know. If I would quit bouncing my skeleton around too far here, we'll zoom in on the vertebral column. All right, the naming of the vertebrae is not difficult at all. So you actually have, in an adult, you have 26 bones along your vertebral column, and 19 of those are what we call, 24 of those are what we call vertebrae. So you have 24 vertebrae that actually circle around and help protect the spinal cord. And they're pretty easy to name. So let's zoom in up here on the neck first. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Those first 7 that you see there are called your cervical vertebrae. Okay, and remember cervical region, I told you guys those region names and from chapter 1 would come back again, and here they are. Those are your cervical vertebrae. And you may have heard of that before, and if you haven't, now that you've learned it, you're going to hear about people saying, well, I had to have my C4 and C5 vertebrae fused together. I've got a bulging disc around my fourth thoracic vertebrae. You'll hear that type of terminology pretty frequently. All right, so those are the top 7, and they're just numbered from top to bottom, 1 through 7. All right, now I do want to zoom in, and we'll take a closer look at these shortly. The first vertebra has another name, and it is the atlas. Okay, and if you guys remember when we were going over the occipital bone, this bone right here in the skull, remember the occipital condyles, which are actually right in there, and I said, you know, they have a rocker type shape, and they sit into a fossa or depression on the first cervical vertebra, and that's what allows you to be able to rock your skull back and forth like that. All right, so since the skull sits on top of that vertebra has another name. It's also called the atlas. So if you've seen pictures of Atlas holding up the globe, this vertebra is sort of like Atlas, except it's holding up your skull instead of a globe. So that's where it gets its name. All right, and then the second vertebra actually has its own little special name too. It can be called C2. It's fine to refer to it as C2, but it's also known as the axis. Now let me deselect that for a second. I'm going to highlight the C1, so keep a visual on where that's located. I'm going to hide it, and now I'm going to highlight the C2 vertebra again. Incidentally, all the light gray stuff you see on here, those are dense regular connective tissues. Those are ligaments that help hold all these bones together. And do you see how it's got that little prominent part on there? Almost looks like a turtle head, a turtle sticking its head up in the air. That is a bony process that sticks upward. And when you move your head around this way, when you do that rotation from left to right, the atlas is rotating back and forth around that process. And so because of that, this bone has another name. It's called the axis, because it's that little projection you see there, which does have a name. It's called the odontoid process, or the dens, which we'll come back to. Around that process, the atlas rotates, makes that rotational motion to the left and to the right. Okay? And the bad thing is I left my C1 vertebra off of there, but maybe we won't have to come back to it. Let's just move on down. All right, so we said the top 7 vertebrae are the cervical ones, C1 through C7. Then your next 12, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. These are your thoracic vertebrae. They're numbered T1 to T12, so that's pretty easy. One on the up here is T1, the one down here is T12, and all right, so one key feature of your thoracic vertebrae is those are the ones that your ribs articulate with. So if we zoom in over here on the side, you can see each of those vertebrae I have highlighted in blue there is contacting a rib, left and a right rib on each side. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So even your floating ribs down there are forming points of contact with those lower two thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's deselect all of those. Move my spinal column up here. The last 5 vertebrae are your lumbar vertebrae, and you've heard of people talking about lumbar pain, lower back pain before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's that lumbar lower back regional term from chapter 1. It's back as well. These are your biggest, thickest vertebrae, which makes sense. I mean, think about your body weight. As you go lower on the vertebral column, then you're going to have to support more and more body weight, so it makes sense that the vertebrae are thicker as you move in an inferior direction down the vertebral column. So those don't contact any ribs. That you can see there are a lot of connective tissues, all that gray stuff that's helping to hold all these vertebrae together. It's sort of important to keep your vertebral column as stable as you possibly can. All right. Let me deselect those. The next bone down the list, I'm going to highlight it there in blue. Now it's got a lot of ligaments wrapped around it, but still you can see it pretty well, and you can also see it as we look down in here in the pelvic cavity, highlighted in blue there. This is a bone called the sacrum, and it is articulates up here with your L5 vertebra, and then kind of bows backwards and forms part of the posterior bowl of the pelvis. And it also articulates with the last bone along your vertebral column. Let me deselect that one. This one, which kind of looks like a rattlesnake tail there, that is called the coccyx, C-O-C-C-Y-X. That's what a lot of people refer to as their tailbone, right in there. Okay, now in a child, you may notice on the study guide, we said there are 26 bones, vertebral bones in adults. In a child, the sacrum, right in here, is actually 5 separate bones. And you can kind of see that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 different levels of that bone. And so in a child, those are all separate bones. But by the time you become an adult, all of those 5 bones have grown together and created one sacrum. And then the coccyx, oops, clicked on the wrong thing, right in there. If you zoom in, you can see 1, 2, 3 layers to that bone. And that's in a child. By the time you become an adult, those 3 portions of that bone, 3 regions, have fused together and have just become a single bone. Okay, I think I'm actually going to stop this video here because the next one there are some features of the different types of vertebrae we need to take a look at. So there are some differences between cervical and thoracic and lumbar vertebrae that allow you to identify one of those. Like if you just saw a thoracic vertebrae sitting out on a table, how in the world would you know that it's a thoracic vertebrae? There are certain features that only thoracic vertebrae have that cervical and lumbar don't. And there are features that cervical vertebrae have that thoracic and lumbar vertebrae don't. So we're going to go over some of those features, unique features that they have, as well as features that your vertebrae have in common. So I'm going to do a separate little video clip specifically on particular features of the vertebrae.